Welcome, everybody. We are very excited to have you join us for this webinar. MCEA's year at the Minnesota Supreme Court. Thanks so much for being here. As we begin today's program, I want to acknowledge that this virtual showcase is replacing our biggest fundraiser of the year and raises critical money for MCEA to do its work. So we'd like to take a moment and recognize our generous sponsors that have made these events possible. You can see their names in front of you now. Thank you so much to all of our donors and sponsors who make the work of MCEA what it is. Today's event, MCEA's year at the Minnesota Supreme Court, is just one element of our Voices Driving Change program about MCEA's work that we're doing this fall. Please learn more about our upcoming events, read the stories of Voices Driving Change in our magazine, and support our work at www.voicesdrivingchange.org. And for sure, plan to join us for Legally Green on September 24th. That's next Thursday at 7 o'clock. This capstone event is our annual fundraising event, and it's unlike any other virtual event that you've been invited to. Beautifully staged with fresh and dynamic content, this 35-minute program will leave you energized and inspired, we guarantee it. After the event, you'll have the opportunity to hear some untold stories and ask questions of our team. So register today for that. Again, go to www.voicesdrivingchange.org. If this is your first time joining us, thank you for being here. The Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy uses law and science to protect Minnesota's environment, its natural resources, and the health of its people. Thanks to the investment of people like you, MCEA has been on the forefront of Minnesota's environmental movement for almost 50 years. MCEA works in the courts, at the legislature, and with public agencies to create, strengthen, and enforce smart environmental laws. All of our work at MCEA is made possible by the generous support of our donors. Please join us in fighting for a healthy and sustainable future. You can do so by texting Drive Change to 844-949-3684, or you can visit www.voicesdrivingchange.org, where you will find information about how to make a donation. Your support makes more possible. All right, let's get started. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm Kevin Reuther. I'm MCEA's Chief Legal Officer. And with me today to talk about our cases pending before the Minnesota Supreme Court are three of our brilliant attorneys, Ann Cohen, Elise Larson, and Evan Mulholland. We have set aside about 30 to 40 minutes. So sit back, relax, get a cup of coffee if you'd like. I have my tea here. And we're going to talk about the cases that we have going in front of the Supreme Court. We have 5 cases that we're participating in this summer and fall, which is pretty amazing for an organization our size. And so I want to have an opportunity for you to meet the attorneys. We'll start with some introductions. We'll describe the cases that I've been talking about, the status of those cases, and then hopefully give you a peek behind the curtain of what it's like to prepare for these cases and be in front of our highest court here in Minnesota. There is a question and answer function here, and we want to make sure that we leave time for your questions. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, if you're hovering with your arrow, you'll see a Q&A box, and you can put your questions in there. Those should pop up for me while we're going, and I'll be able to ask the attorneys whatever questions you have. So let's get started. Ann, why don't we start with you? What brings you to MCEA? How did you end up here as one of our seasoned senior attorneys?
Seasoned, I think, is a euphemism for older. So yes, welcome everybody. I hope I'm also joined by other seasoned people here this morning. I am a child of the 1960s environmental movement. I always loved science and outdoors. And luckily, growing up in St. Louis, Missouri, I had parents. My dad was a scientist and my mother was an outdoors woman who really supported and nurtured my interest in that. I tried science for a little while, but frankly, it wasn't the best fit for me. And I decided on a law career, and I ended up moving here from New York City, where I'd gone to law school, and ended up at the Minnesota Attorney General's office for 32 years, where I represented the environmental agencies, primarily the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So my nickname around the office is Deep State. And it was truly a fascinating journey working at the state of Minnesota. But I was able to retire, and I still had a fair bit of energy. So I thought I would come to MCEA and just help out, be part-time. But then I met a lady named Polly, or rather Polly met. And here I am today.
It's great having Ann on our staff. As you can imagine, having someone with that kind of experience with the state agencies is really incredible. Maybe not everybody knows. I mean, we end up in lawsuits against industry, obviously, but most of our cases actually have a state agency as one of the opponents too, because those industries are getting permits from the state agency. And in fact, Ann and I, in her previous job, had some cases against one another, didn't we, Ann?
We had some cases, and then we were opposites, and then we had some cases where we sat on the same side of the table.
It's
true. So it's always complicated, but it was always a pleasure to deal with MCEA.
Well, and it was we think it was a real coup to get Ann to join us after her retirement from the AG's office. So, Elise, do you want to introduce yourself? Elise is also one of our senior attorneys. She coordinates our water work. How did you end up here at MCEA doing a public interest environmental law job?
Yeah, so I would say I became an environmentalist when I was in junior high. I grew up in a little town north or to the west of Bemidji by about a half hour, so way up north. And when I was in junior high school, a developer purchased all of the land around a small lake where I had grown up. And I was really concerned about what the impacts were going to be to the lake from such a large development on a little lake. And so starting in junior high, I developed a research project to research what the health impacts were, and did that all the way through high school and college. And so that really, spurred my interest in environmental policy and environmental law. I got an environmental studies degree at Concordia College, and then I went to law school. As a child of the recession, as I call myself, I had a little bit of a winding journey to get my dream job at MCEA. And as part of that, I did a little under 4 years of clerking, which is working directly for a judge and helping them in their decision-making process. And one of the places where I worked was the Minnesota Supreme Court, where all of these cases are appearing.
So it sounds like your journey to MCEA really began as an 8th grader.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what's the status of the lake with the development now?
There's a lot of houses. I wasn't very successful as an 8th grader. And the water quality has gone down. My studies showed that the water quality went down over time. So the fish populations now are much more, have fish that can handle higher amounts of pollution in the lake than they did when I was younger.
Cool. All right, how about Evan? Evan, what brings you to MCEA?
Hey, good morning, Kevin. Good morning, everyone. So I have a sort of a similar story as Ann, actually. So I've always felt very connected to the environment and wild places growing up and throughout my life. And so after law school, after I completed my law degree, I ended up working in New Hampshire. Most of my career was in environmental enforcement with the New Hampshire Attorney General's office. And then for a while, I also led the enforcement arm of the agency in New Hampshire, equivalent to the PCA here, which there was the DES, mainly focused on the Clean Air Act. So 2 years ago in 2018, my family and I moved here to Minneapolis, and I started working as a staff attorney at MCEA. It's a terrific job. I love working with these folks, fighting for people and fighting for the living world we all depend on.
Yeah. I want to mention about Evan, his Clean Air Act experience. It's actually the Clean Air Act, for anybody on the line who's an environmental lawyer, you'll know, is very, very complicated. There are very few attorneys really in the whole country who have experience and expertise in that. So it's been wonderful having Evan join us.
Thanks, Kevin.
And Evan, you also have some specialized training. You went to Vermont.
I did, sort of in between there. I went to Vermont for a year for an advanced degree in LLM in environmental law too.
Yeah, great. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about these cases that we have before the Minnesota Supreme Court. I mentioned that we're participating in 5 of them. In 3 of those, we're the litigant, so we're the party that actually brought the lawsuit that wound its way up into the Supreme Court. 2 of them have to do with the Polymet project, which is a sulfide mining proposal. I'm guessing that pretty much everybody on this call has heard of Polymet. And then one of them has to do with proposed fossil fuel gas plant in Superior, Wisconsin. Maybe we could start with that one, Evan. Do you want to talk about NTEC? Give sort of the basics of NTEC and why it is that we care about it?
Sure. So we've been fighting the NTEC battle for, I think, about 5 years now. NTEC, if built, would be a brand new gas-fired, fracked gas-fired power plant that Minnesota Power, the utility up in the Duluth area, is seeking to build in Superior, Wisconsin. And it's right at the Minnesota border, actually right behind Park Point in Duluth, if you're familiar there. So the reason we really care about this is that it's a huge investment of funds. If built, this plant would run for 40 or 50 years, and it would emit enormous amounts of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. And the case really is about the PUC's approval of this plant. That's the Public Utilities Commission here in St. Paul. They approved the plant without any environmental review under MEPA. So we appealed this to the Court of Appeals, this failure to conduct environmental review, and won. And the Court of Appeals sent it back. And that decision was appealed to the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Yeah. And I mean, what's the big deal about this gas plant? And by the way, I should just interject here. Environmental lawyers use a lot of acronyms. So MEPA is the Minnesota Environmental Policy Act. That's the law that requires environmental review. You got the PUC in there, but we might fail you a little bit in using some acronyms. Feel free to put that in the Q&A if you don't know what we're talking about. But anyway, what's the big deal about NTEC? Like, why should an organization and why should all of our supporters care about it?
We should care because of the climate. I mean, this is a huge investment of ratepayer funds and investment of Minnesota utility to basically spend money on a gas plant when they should be spending money in the opposite direction, building solar and wind and making things more efficient. That's the future of the grid, and that's the future we should be moving towards. And this is unnecessary, is what our experts have testified.
Mm-hmm. And so far, we've been able to stop that plant.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yes. So far.
All right. So that's one of Evan's cases that's pending now. He actually has another one that's one of the Polymet cases, and Anne has the other against the DNR. Anne, maybe you could describe those 2 cases a bit.
Sure. So yes, we actually have 2 Polymet cases pending in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court right now, which is pretty amazing. So the first case that I'll touch on is the one involving DNR's permits. These are the permit to build the mine and the permit to build the dam, which is going to hold back the tailings that the mine is going to generate. And those cases were consolidated at the Court of Appeals, and we won at the Court of Appeals our big ask in that case, which is to have a contested case hearing. So we are going up to the Supreme Court in that case as a winner, and we are defending our win at the Court of Appeals. Now, the Supreme Court will be reviewing the decision, and the main issue will be this contested case hearing. And that's a proceeding where our experts get to testify, and we get to challenge DNR's experts all before a neutral administrative law judge. So not the agency which may be biased in favor of the mine, wanting to promote the mine, instead in front of a neutral administrative law judge. So we think this is a pretty important case. And so we're hoping that the Supreme Court agrees with the Court of Appeals in that case that we met a high bar for getting one of these contested case hearings. The other case is a case that Evan, again, is the lead on because it involves air, which is his area of expertise. But I've been working also pretty extensively with Evan on it because it involves my area of expertise, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. And in that case, again, at the Court of Appeals, we won. And the issue primarily in that case was whether MCEA needed to investigate a certain issue. And that issue was whether or not PolyMet would seek to expand its operation after it got its air permit. Because air permitting is pretty special. And PolyMet wanted to get a special kind of air permit that you only get if you're a minor source. And they accepted some limits to get that permit. But then at the very same time, they're telling their investors that they intend to expand the facility because that's what's more profitable. So we told the PCA, you need to look at this issue. You need to take a hard look. And PCA didn't. And so we brought that issue to the Court of Appeals and won. And now we're going to defend that win in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court.
Well, those are the three cases that we're litigants in. And in each case, as Ann just described and Evan described, we won at the Court of Appeals, and it's the agency and the industry that have appealed to the Supreme Court. The DNR PolyMet case and Evans NTech case are both already briefed, and you guys have oral arguments coming up in October. The air case is still in briefing, so that oral argument would be sometime later this fall. We are participating in a couple of other cases, though, as an amicus. And I'm wondering, Elise, if you could describe for folks what it means to be an amicus party, why that's important, and what those cases are.
Yeah, so particularly at the Minnesota Supreme Court, amicus briefs are really important. So an amicus brief is also known as a friend of the court brief. And so what they provide is, in a normal case, you have some particular facts that the judges need to apply the law to in interpreting what the law is. But what a friend of the court brief does is tell the court, make sure that you're thinking about future cases, make sure that you're thinking about the implications of what could happen if you make a particular decision. And so we have two cases right now where we've participated as an amicus. One is the Mintac case and another is the Smart Growth case, both of which are dealing with bedrock environmental laws, issues interpreting really fundamental laws that we use to protect the environment. And so we have submitted briefs to ask the court to ensure that they are interpreting those laws in the way so that they remain as robust and powerful tools that we can use to protect Minnesota's environment.
So Elise, you actually clerked for the Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, right?
I did.
And I think that gave you a really good view of what happens behind the scenes. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how the court selects cases. I mean, we have these 5 cases that we're working on. I can tell you I've worked at MCEA for 15 years now, and having 5 cases that we're working on at the same time in front of the Minnesota Supreme Court is totally unprecedented. Since I've been at MCEA, we've only had a couple of cases before the Supreme Court. And the Minnesota Supreme Court doesn't have to hear every case that comes that wants to be heard there. So give us a little bit of insight of how that works.
Yeah, so the most recent statistics are from 2018, and the court took about 150 cases. And so if you assume the court takes about the same number of cases in a year, that's about what we're looking at. The problem is the number of cases that they take on discretionary review, which is all environmental cases, is really driven by the number of cases that they have to hear. So In 2018, only 30 of those 150 cases, well, a little over 30 of those 150 cases were these discretionary cases, when there were over 400 cases that that there were lawyers that asked the court to take review. So it really is a high bar to cross to get the Supreme Court to say, yeah, this is a really important case, or this case is raising some really important issues that we think it's important for us to review. And that makes a lot of sense, because the Supreme Court is not what they call an error correcting court. The Supreme Court is taking cases because they've been set up in a way to help us understand the law in Minnesota as effectively as possible. And that's why they want to take some cases over others.
So what you've said is that there are maybe 30 or 40, we don't know the exact number, of cases that the court is selecting this year to review. 5 of those are involving really important environmental issues, and we're participating in them. That's just a really high percentage, and really interesting, I think. And maybe you can talk a little bit about what it's like to prepare for, doing the briefs for Minnesota Supreme Court case and getting ready for the oral argument a little bit about that.
Sure. It is different to prepare for a Supreme Court case as opposed to a Court of Appeals case, or indeed an administrative trial or a trial in district court. To prepare for a Minnesota Supreme Court case, you first have to recognize that the issues have been winnowed down. You're not going to be able to argue every issue that you argued at the Court of Appeals to the Minnesota Supreme Court. You really have to focus on the issues that likely were the ones that the court was interested in hearing, the ones that were the subject of the appeal. And you can reserve a few other issues if they're really important to you to argue in front of the court. But you're not going to do the whole laundry list of issues that you might have argued in front of the Court of Appeals. You're going to focus. The other thing you're going to do is you're really going to think big in front of the Supreme Court. You're going to be aware, like Elise said and Kevin said, that the Supreme Court doesn't take every case, and they're not just there to correct errors. They're really looking at the law and the development of the law and how the law is going to apply to the whole state of Minnesota and to the cases that will be following your case. So you have to be mindful of the big issues. And you might get more into a policy question at the Minnesota Supreme Court, like what would be the effect on future cases if the Supreme Court interpreted the law in a particular way? How will that affect cases ongoing? You have to be prepared for a lot of hypothetical questions from the court. You have to think more like a law professor when you're up at the Minnesota Supreme Court. You need to take a step back and really dig in and think deeply about the issues.
And Evan, you have 2 cases that you've been preparing. I mean, give us a sense of how much work that is. Is this the only thing that you've been doing all summer, pretty much?
Pretty much, Kevin. It's a ton of work to write briefs. I want to say that it's really actually a team effort. We work as teams, as project teams on these briefs, and there's several lawyers and a paralegal team and clerks usually that are working on different aspects of the brief. Each brief is about 50 pages, so it's a significant production. And I think my mom is on the line here. She knows I've been pretty busy, how little I've been talking to them. So it's a lot of work. And now, like Ann said, we're preparing for oral argument in 2 of these cases, and these are going to be online. They're going to be through WebEx. So that's something we've never done before. I've never done before. So we're trying to figure out if there's a different way we need to prepare for those.
Yeah, we have a
by
question
watching
about
other arguments and thinking it through.
We have a question about that and just kind of the remote work situation and how that's impacted preparing. Anybody have thoughts about that?
It's more difficult to communicate, that's for sure, when you're not in the office talking to your paralegal, talking to the team, but we've adapted.
Mm-hmm. We had a question for you, Ann, about the assistant AG's kind of responsibility to its client, the agency, versus larger considerations of the constitutional role of the AG?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So, especially vis-a-vis the polymed cases, because the polymed cases have a difference. In those cases, the state agencies are not being represented by the Minnesota Attorney General's office. And you might well question how that has changed the way the representation works. When the Attorney General's office is representing a state agency, we have the ability as a former assistant AG, you have the ability to really say no to your client. AGs represent the people of the state of Minnesota, state agencies represent the people of the state of Minnesota, but there are separate structures there. The AG is a constitutionally elected separate officer and ultimately controls the litigation of the state. So theoretically, although it doesn't happen very often, the Attorney General's office can say to a state agency, no, this position that you're taking on the law is simply not supportable. And an interesting question in the polymed case would be, how has that relationship been affected by the fact that the Attorney General is not representing the state agencies in that case?
Yeah. So one thing about all these cases that we've mentioned is that we won below, and now the Supreme Court is going to review all the cases. I think that somebody could conclude that maybe the Supreme Court wants to correct an error below. Elise, you participated in the whole process of figuring out how the court selects its cases. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that. What are the criteria that they might be looking at in choosing these cases? Should we be concerned that they're just taking the cases because they think the Court of Appeals got it wrong? What do you think?
The Supreme Court is not an error-correcting court, and they're not going to take a case simply because they think the Court of Appeals got it wrong. They're really looking for either that, this is a factual case that's going to have big implications for Minnesota, or they're probably looking at that there are some really meaty legal issues that warrant the Supreme Court creating some resolution in the law so that in the future we know what the law is with regard to some of these issues. I think that it's really important, and I think that people often forget that the Supreme Court is made up of 7 individual people. So each of those individual people may have a different reason for why they thought review should be granted in this case. And frankly, it only requires 4 justices to want to get review. And so, we're maybe looking at, 4 justices that wanted review, and they may have 4 separate reasons for why they thought these cases were important.
That's interesting. We have a question in the chat sort of related to that, talking about how the justices may have distinct styles and how do you prepare for that? Anybody want to answer?
Well, sure, I can jump in on that. It does help if you know the personalities of the various justices and what they're likely to know. Like Elise has worked for the chief judge, and what has warned us, and it's a good thing, that the chief judge will always want to know what is the rule of law that you want this court to adopt. So we know that justice has that particular need to hear that articulated with every case, and so we're going to certainly be prepared for that. Fortunately, and this is something that's available to the public as well, it's not limited to attorneys, you can watch videotape oral arguments that other attorneys have made recently at the Minnesota Supreme Court. So you can get a feel for how the various justices approach the case. Which one is into the technical details, which one wants more broad policy, and you can sort of get a flavor for how these cases go. And so if anybody is curious about this, I highly recommend. There's some very interesting arguments that you can listen to right now that have been videotaped at the Supreme Court, including one, a challenge to a law I didn't even realize was being challenged by the Democratic National Committee. Very interesting.
So I want to invite folks to put your questions in the Q&A. There's a little bubble at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A, and you can put your questions in there. There is a question about what the impact will be if we win in PolyMet, or maybe if we win in NTech. Yes, the question is also, what's the impact if we lose? Maybe quickly, can you address that, Evan?
Sure, I'll talk about NTech for a second. If we prevail, if the Supreme Court upholds the Court of Appeals decision, it goes back to the Public Utilities Commission. They'll have to start from scratch after they do environmental review of the plant. So that's what happens if we win. And we're optimistic, and we're confident, at least to the part that the numbers keep getting worse for gas plants. It keeps getting cheaper to build wind and solar as opposed to investing lots of money in new fossil fuel plants. And that's what we're going to be pressing Minnesota Power ongoing in their IRP, which is their resource planning for the next 15, 20-year period.
In the PolyMet case, because there are multiple cases, I guess it's a little bit more complicated. People should also know that Elise is working on a case against PolyMet and the MCEA involving the water permit. That hasn't risen to the level of the Supreme Court yet. But all of our cases have resulted in stopping PolyMet full stop for now. Its permits have been stayed or voided. And so if we win, that will presumably continue. If we lose in these particular instances, there are other avenues that we'll continue to pursue. Let's see. Elaborate on what firm is representing the state agencies regarding PolyMet, and what industry do they often represent?
I'll answer that one. So actually, it's an interesting story. I'll try to keep it real short because I know we're out of time, but I noticed that there have been a number of questions coming up in the Q&A and chat. So the Minnesota Attorney General's office has to approve the hiring of private counsel, and former Attorney General Lori Swanson approved the hiring of private counsel at DNR's request. DNR approached the Attorney General's office and asked Attorney General Swanson to approve that, and she did. The firm that was hired was called Crowell & Mooring, but then Crowell & Mooring had sort of an implosion, and lawyers went one direction and other lawyers went another direction. And so now the firm that is representing the DNR is called Holland & Hart. And primarily Holland & Hart represents mining interests, including the National Mining Association, of which PolyMet is a member. So that is kind of a curious thing. And MCEA approached the state of Minnesota and protested the hiring of this firm, but unfortunately that protest was ignored.
Okay, another question here. Why did the appeals court decision raise questions for Supreme Court justices? Was the decision flawed? You addressed that a little bit, Elise, but do you want to say a little bit more about, in these instances, what might have drawn the court to take these cases?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, different justices might have had different reasons. I don't think that it's because, I think it's very unlikely that they have granted review because they have already made a decision that the Court of Appeals got it wrong. I think that there are a few factors, one being most of these cases have very specific legal questions where the Supreme Court is the court that makes the ultimate decision about what a statute that the legislature writes means, and that they think they need to resolve these legal questions so that there's some clarity in the law. I also think, particularly with PolyMet, this is the first copper nickel mine in the state, and there may be justices who think regardless, it's very of the legal issues that it's important for them to review and make sure that the law is being applied correctly for a project that will have this big of a precedential effect in the state. But those are just some of the factors, but I think it's highly unlikely that the main reason review has been granted is because they have already decided the Court of Appeals got it wrong.
Thanks. I really want people to know that we are ready for these fights. So, you know, there are 4 of us here today, but we have other lawyers on staff. We have a bunch of law clerks doing research projects. We've been working very, very hard for many months on these cases and will continue to through the fall. And all of that work is made possible by you all and the support of our donors and supporters. So we just want to say a big thank you for that. And thank you for being here today. I'm seeing that we're at 8:37 and I said that we would go for 40 minutes, so I think that we need to wind up. But we do want to thank you for participating in this event and invite you to the rest of the events that we have going on over the next week. And in particular, we want to ask you to join us in fighting for a healthy and sustainable future. You can do that by texting Drive Change to that number, 844-949-3684. Or maybe it's easier just to go to www.voicesdrivingchange.org. You'll find information there about all of our events. And you'll also find a way to donate if this is an important cause for you. It's your help that makes this work possible. We've set a very ambitious goal for ourselves in this fall fundraising drive or with this event. And I think it's 280,000. I hope that I have that right, Chris. And I believe that we're about 70% of the way there. So if you can help us out at reaching that goal, please do. You see the website in front of you or the number to text. I hope that you'll continue to enjoy the events in our showcase. And in particular, I want to call out our event next Thursday, Legally Green. This is the online virtual event that's kind of substituting for our usual gala. It's at 7 o'clock Thursday. You need to register. So again, go to www.voicesdrivingchange.org and you can sign up there. You know, if you have more questions about anything that we've talked about today, please feel free to reach out. You can reach out to me or any of the attorneys that you see here. Our emails are on our website, and we're happy to talk with you or exchange emails if you have more questions for us. Thanks again for being here, everybody, and have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.